unusually quiet audience. Oh,
They're convinced.
at the back. Joe at the back.
Hi, I'm Jo McRae from DFID. Thanks very much, as ever, for a very inspiring speech. And I think many of the things you lay out I'd really agree with. One comment and then also a question. So the comment is, I suppose what's different about this summit is that it has been a very open process. And I guess my observation is then that just as it's been a multi-stakeholder approach, that means that in a sense, it's up to all of us to make it work. And I think we've all got a lot of work to do to make that happen, but it needs to be a lot of different types of people coming together. So, in a sense, success is down to us all. I guess my question is, in terms of thinking about the politics of change, particularly it's useful sometimes to think about what the incentives are, and it would just be interesting to think about what are the incentives that you think we should be pointing out to political leadership to promote greater compliance with international humanitarian law. What's the argument we should be putting forward there? And then what are the incentives that we should be putting forward to the Interagency Standing Committee and indeed to donors about why reform is a good idea? Thanks.
Thank you. There was somebody else.
Thank you. That was fantastic. You mentioned about there was some progress in Sendai. Uni Krishnan and I work with Plan International. You mentioned about Sendai where there was some progress. At the same time, the difficulty to refine and reform UN. If you look at 15 years ago, the same critique was heard about the World Bank and IMF that they're not being people-friendly, they are anti-people and anti-poor and so on. Then you see the G8 summits and massive demonstrations in Seattle and all sorts of places. And there is some feeling that there were some changes within the thinking in the World Bank. So if that was a change, so what is it that they did differently? The people who wanted to change the World Bank differently, through which they were able to achieve some success, which is not happening now. Or are there some lessons from people who work on DRR, who ended up in Sendai or Hyogo, or the one who have been trying to reform the World Bank, which we can learn from?
Thank you. Hiba?
Hi, thank you. Hiba Ali with Iran News. Ambassador, I'm interested in, you and others have alluded to the fact that the WHS Secretariat and OCHA have failed to put forward a roadmap to create the kind of change that you've outlined. How do you see others, whether within the WHS process or outside of it, taking that lead instead and pushing the process forward? Thanks.
Thanks. We want to start with this. So, three, very important questions, starting with, Joe, and what kind of incentives are we going to put to our political leaders, but also to the ISC, on one side about compliance with IHL and reform, and the questions around what can we learn from the DRR and Hyogo process, and Hiba in the roadmap. We just touched it to develop the roadmap now.
The questions of incentives is a very difficult one. And it's difficult because, unfortunately, leaders do not move except when a crisis hits. When I talk to many of my German friends informally, and I tell them, had I been to Germany and asked them for some assistance for Syrian refugees before the crisis, what would have the answer been? And they would answer me, no. And then when the crisis hit, Germany was compelled to add 3 billion euros to the budget to address this crisis. So it is very unfortunate, but sometimes this is what it takes for leaders to have a political will to move. I've seen hundreds of pictures in the last few years about the situation in Syria, in Palestine, in Iraq, in Central African Republic, in Sudan, in Somalia. We've seen them all. The picture that moved the world was the picture of young Ilan. I don't know why. But this is a fact. And this moved the conscience of the world. Does this mean that the solution that we should have more pictures that moves the world? I have no idea. But it is a challenge. And this is one of the reasons why, in relation to preparedness, I was talking about more work in order to convince leaders that investing in preparedness is important and pays off. Why? Because we don't spend money on preparedness. And this has to change. As for the UN system also needs to recognize. And I think the message will come to them loud and clear that their financial resources will be affected if they do not start working together in a manner that yields the results that are expected. It's up to them. If they continue to wait, the price will be high. But those who will embrace change perhaps will be winning in the very near future. So it is a question also of leadership within the UN system in relation to embracing reform and embracing change. But we'll see how things evolve. Some are more willing to move than others. But I think this is a huge challenge that will be facing the UN system. The second question in relation to the World Bank and Sendai and the progress and how can this evolve in the future. Resistance to change is the norm. So the norm is that people resist change. And despite the fact that the World Bank has done a lot of effort, it's not yet popular. But they're trying. But I think the UN is in a different league and is seen in a different light. And in many instances, in Sendai, for example, it is also seen as the responsibility of governments, because the document that was negotiated, the outcome that was negotiated, was in an intergovernmental setting. And interestingly enough, this has been the case in almost all the UN summits that took place in the last 2 or 3 decades, perhaps since Rio or before. So most of these summits, their outcomes was an outcome that was agreed between governments. For the first time in history, the UN is in the driving seat for the World Humanitarian Summit. And this has advantages, but it also has huge risks, because the criticism, if things fail, can go either to member states that were not able to agree, if it's an intergovernmental process. But if not, if it's a UN-led process, then the criticism will go to the UN system. And this is why the success of this summit is, from my view, crucial for the United Nations. And this brings me to the roadmap. That is why it is difficult for anybody else to lead, because the UN is in the driving seat. And I don't think that we should be moving at cross purposes. The first phase, as I said, was a very interesting phase. And it was quite important. And there are a large number of ideas. But now is the difficult part, because now is the time to choose the priorities. What are we going to focus on? And this means that we will drop some recommendations, postpone others, refine a third group, and so on. So this is the difficult part. And the difficult part has to be done on a platform that includes everybody. I suggested to them in the global consultations to have a 3-track approach. where one of the tracks would take the synthesis report, take the recommendations, divide it into recommendations that are directed towards governments, those that are directed to international NGOs, those that are directed to the UN system, those that are directed to academicians, to business community, and discuss it with these people. And also to try to see how we can have thematic discussions on the outcome that we need to get on displaced persons, for example. What are we going to do the day after Istanbul, and so on? How to benefit from, to build on the effort that was done on a regional basis, because this was crucial in all these ideas that came to the UN system. And we are yet to see how the UN will deal with many of these recommendations in order to come up with a coherent outcome for the World Humanitarian Summit.
Thank you. More questions?
Sabah Mubaslat, I'm the CEO of the Humanitarian Leadership Academy. A comment and a question. I'm so pleased to see that the slide reads beyond the World Humanitarian Summit, which means that we're optimistic that there will be a beyond. I mean, how drastically and rapidly things are changing makes me wonder, coming from the Middle East, what's going to happen between now and May next year. The other line in the slide says political blockages, which makes me wonder again, how sincere are we in approving shift in power from north to south? And how sincere are we when it comes to sustaining impact and not only sustaining the presence of certain entities or international organizations in the south? My question to you, you said rightly so that slogans are empty shells unless, backed up with political will. Nowadays, politics is not being only played by state actors. Non-state actors are playing a lot of politics. How inclusive would the World Humanitarian Summit be of the non-state actors' representatives?
Which non-state actors? Which ones?
All those that we categorize differently, from extreme to extreme.
You want Daesh to be in the summit?
I'll leave that to you.
Okay.
Other questions?
Thank you, Ambassador. Hello? Yeah?
It's working.
Thank you, Ambassador, for a very insightful talk. So I'm Vicky from Médecins Sans Frontières here in the UK. So I had a question about your comments on reform, and what you suggested was, what you hoped for was an inclusive nature of a potential reform process. And I guess that sort of leads me to assume that the vision, if you like, is for an all-encompassing humanitarian system, one where everybody is kind of singing from the same hymn sheet and everybody's working together. But we know, in fact, that the OIC has in the past set up parallel coordination systems, in fact, to great effect, when the traditional system, for want of a better way of describing it, was not actually able to access. I'm thinking of Somalia, of course. And so I'm just wondering if actually the ideal end state is an all-encompassing humanitarian system, or whether really we want a system that has different variants to it, whereby we can basically use the best tool in the box for that situation. Because, I think that probably, from my perspective, I would say an ideal end state of an all-encompassing humanitarian system. I'm not sure we're ever going to get it, and I'm not sure actually that we should be striving for it either.
Thanks, Vicky. It'll be very interesting to hear your answer to that. Other questions? Otherwise, we'll stop to that. So we'll take one last. Oh, yes, please, gentlemen at the front. Can we have a microphone here?
John Metcalf from a British organisation, British Association of Social Workers. I was just wondering how you saw the contribution of the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation to this. You obviously have experience in particular of that group, and how they will assist in this process.
you want to take these three? And then I'll take one last round before we conclude.
Well, in relation to shifting power from the north to the south, I wouldn't want to put it in that way. I would want to put it in a way, as I mentioned, to see how we can benefit from the strong capabilities of different parts. The local organizations can do many things that international organizations can't, and vice versa. I wouldn't want to see Save the Children disappear. Absolutely not. Or Médecins Sans Frontières, or CARE, or many others. They are an integral part of the system. And they will continue. They have been around for hundreds of years, and they will continue to be for, I hope, many more, as long as we have problems that would need humanitarian assistance. But the question is the question of balance, and a question of allowing people to be able to help their own communities when crisis hits. And this is possible. This is not, this is not something that is a dream that is very difficult to achieve. I think this is achievable. And the question is, how are we going to do it? And we are yet to agree on how we are going to do it. But I think there is a recognition by the international civil society organizations that things need to change. And a number of key international civil society organizations indicated that they are willing to do some changes. Will it be easy? Of course not. Nothing is easy. But does this mean that we should shy away? No, of course not. As for non-state actors, depending on what kind of non-state actors you're talking about. Everybody has their own non-state actors that they like, and the non-state actors that they don't like. The question is, how are we going to do that in an objective way? Without these political coloring of, as long as we're dealing with humanitarian issues, without the political coloring of, well, this organization, because of political reasons, will be painted and put in this category because it is against one political power, superpower or another. So this is the crucial point, whether we would be able to deal with issues of that nature. And this is where the role of research centers like HPG can say, absolutely not. This is somebody that we can deal with, but this is also another organization that we cannot deal with, and so on. So I think that this is the important part. Vicky, in relation to Médecins Sans Frontières, I'm not asking for an all-encompassing system that would gather everybody and that we will be all reading from the same hymn. No. Why? Because we have different problems of different nature that will be dealt with in different ways. And you mentioned the situation in Somalia. When I was asked about the situation in Somalia, I said this should be the case all over the world. We should all be rallying behind those who are capable of doing the job. In Ebola, it was Médecins Sans Frontières. It wasn't the World Humanitarian, it wasn't the World Health Organization. So people rallied behind Médecins Sans Frontières in Ebola. And I was very glad to hear Médecins Sans Frontières being extremely critical of itself in relation, despite the job that they have done. This is something that we lack, we all lack, as a matter of fact, to be self-critical in that manner. And this is why I was extremely respectful of what Médecins Sans Frontières did and how they were critical of themselves as well after they did that job. So whoever is capable, we should all rally behind them and not start fighting and bickering over the division of the pie and who takes what and so on. But we have to see how this can be done in a more efficient way. So if the efficient way at one point in time is for the OIC, well and fine, but then others have to help. If it's at one point in time another Organization of American States, ASEAN, African Union, We're working now with the HPG on how we can benefit from the experience of regional organizations between them in relation to humanitarian effort. So if they can be capable of doing something, well, good and fine. But I'm not arguing that we should have one system that would be all-encompassing and act in a specific way. This is not what I was calling for. As for the role of the OIC beyond Istanbul, we are part of the system with the advantages of, and disadvantages of that. And we take advantage of cooperation with the whole system. Many of the OCHA is our biggest partner. I went to Iraq with OCHA. We went to Chad with OCHA and the African Union. We're going to Pakistan and Afghanistan with OCHA. I just had 10 days ago meeting with the UN system in relation to cooperation between the OIC and the UN system, with World Food Programme, UNICEF, OCHA, UNHCR, and so on, to see how we can advance cooperation. We are working with ICRC on all kinds of issues, and so on. So we have partnerships with the whole system. And we decided that we will not work on any issue alone. Why? Because the problems are too huge for any organization, however big, to work on its own on any issue. The whole world is failing Syria. The whole world is failing Yemen. The whole world is failing South Sudan, and so on. So we're failing too many people, and we're supposed to be working together. So I'm not one of those who are advocating that we should work alone on any issue, and we will not. So we hope that we can work. The whole point is to see how we can work in a more efficient and more effective way in a situation that is becoming much more complicated and much more difficult because of non-state actors, because of the difficulties of transferring money as a result of efforts to combat terrorism. I have NGOs who are partnering with us who are extremely frightened because they are working in areas that are under the control of extremist groups. And their fear is that they may be put on a list of those assisting terrorist organizations. And their fear is that this would not happen, this may not happen today or next year, this may happen 5 years from now. And this may destroy the whole organization. While they are risking their lives in working in some of these very difficult areas to try to gain access to the people that no one else is having access to. And in return, they are under threat and fearful. So we have to see how we can deal with these challenges that are extremely difficult and in situations that are quite dangerous for those, especially those who are working in this field.
Thank you so much. We are technically out of time, but I had promised one last round of questions, and it's such a privilege to have you with us.
It's my pleasure.
Everyone indulges me, I think I'll take one last round, and then we will conclude. If there is any. Yes.
My name is Marcus Manuel. I work here at the Overseas Development Institute. You ended on a note of hope for the World Humanitarian Summit, and you also said the summit ought to be judged by the difference that should make to children and unemployed in Lebanon and Jordan on the Syria crisis. I just wonder if you'd like to join those dots together. What changes do you think that you would like to see at Istanbul will actually make the most difference and change their lives? Thank you.
Thanks.
I didn't get the question.
What changes would you like to see in Istanbul to really make sure that we see practical changes on the ground in the situation of Syria? Similar. If there is no further question, sorry. Oh, the iPad, I'm told that there's the iPad. Sorry, I'll take the online question. So this is from a colleague at King's College. It says, when it comes to humanitarian medicine, response is always immediately directed towards emergency care, injuries, vaccinations, and infectious disease. There is very limited, almost no response to chronic disease such as heart diseases, insulin availability for diabetes and cancer. How do you think this should be responded to in a humanitarian context? So a bit sort of perhaps lateral to the discussion we're having, but widens the breadth of our conversation tonight. Any last question? Otherwise, I'll give you the floor to conclude. So yes, if you had...
Sorry,
Mike.
Ambassador Chris Scott from Chancellor Special... Sorry. Chris Scott. Hello? Yeah, better. Chris Scott from Chancellor Special Projects. Ambassador, we've talked a lot about addressing political blockages. I'm building on the second to last question. Last time I looked, there were about 38 countries around the world where the population below the age of 14 was approximately 30% of the population. And in some 18, I think, the population was even as high as 50% of the population, approaching 50% of the population below the age of 14. Now, certainly the places I've been, people don't actually, sad to say, give a stuff about international humanitarian law. What they want is a job. What they want is a stable environment in which to bring up their families. But if we combine that increasingly young and aspirational population where the aspirations are not met with, for example, the effects of climate change, how are you ever going to just paper over the cracks with just a sort of political or another version of what we've actually seen in the past, where that big idea, which people say doesn't exist, or they haven't seen, how do we get past more of the same and get on to the real underlying issues that are driving the problems in the world?
Okay, so if it is not part of question, you've got the big ideas and big changes are required between today and the summit, and then any concluding remarks that you want to offer.
Well, in relation to the first question, a lot of work has already been done. We had Syria 1, Syria 2, and Syria 3, and they were all held in Kuwait. And we're going to have Syria 4. And Syria 4 will be held here, early February. And it will be done between the UK, Germany, Norway, and Kuwait. And is it easy? Of course not. It's a huge difficulty, particularly that, as you know, in the beginning of a crisis, countries are willing to help, but as time passes by, they start going elsewhere, to other crises. And this is also linked to the question of age, because the 12 million Syrian displaced people, 6 million of them are kids. These 6 million, 3 million of them did not go to school in the last 5 years. And the other 3 went to school in camps or in other places where they have been displaced and so on. So this means that you have 6 million kids who are not really educated. This means that they will continue to remain feeling the distress of this crisis for the next 50, 60 years. And this is, in my view, the biggest catastrophe that this region will face. And we keep talking about extremism and where extremism is coming from. these kids will not be doctors and lawyers. So what I would want to see is a solution that will be realistic. In the document that we have in the sensitive report, they said that no kid should be out of school more than 1 month. I think this is ridiculous. It will not happen. So we have to be more realistic, but then examine what can be done in order to ensure that if we are serious about, even about extremism that the whole world is now focusing on, then you have to deal with some of these problems in a more serious way. And when you talk about burden sharing, a country like Lebanon may break down as a result of the fact that now 1 out of every 3 people living in Lebanon is a Syrian. They can't cope. And it is already a country that was facing difficulties, with a very difficult and sensitive balance between different religions and different ethnic groups and so on. And with the average refugee staying 17 years. So these are the kinds of difficulties that I hope that after the summit, not that they will be resolved in the summit, I know that they will not be resolved in the summit, but at least that we would have ideas for steps that need to be taken in order for this issue to be solved. And this is unfortunately what I don't see right now. The second question in relation to heart diseases, and that the focus is usually on immediate needs. But such is life. You know, you have to focus on the most immediate. But this does not mean that other issues should be forgotten. The shipment that we are working on now for medical assistance to Yemen with the Salman Center in Saudi Arabia is for cancer treatment. And this is medicine that is expensive. And it is not for the immediate emergency need, but it is needed. So we're also trying to think about that. And one of the ideas that were presented in relation to the reform is in relation to assessment. How needs assessments are being done. The problem in needs assessment that they are being done by organizations that want to advance their own work, which is normal. You know, World Food Program, when they go to a place, they have to say, what are the needs in relation to food? World Health Organization, when they go, they say in relation to health, UNESCO in relation to education, or UNICEF in relation to children, and so on. But it is not done in a collective manner, in a way that would reflect the real priorities of society and the categories and the manner in which they have to be reflected. So this is what we need to do in relation to the issue of assessment. As for the difficult question, you know, this is something that is about how we change the world. And if I had the answer, I would have wrote a book about it. That's a very difficult issue. And change usually comes through force. When you are forced to change. It is rare when people decide to change as a result of in normal situations. When things are normal, people tend to go along with the flow and are satisfied with how things are taking place. But then, in order for us to have fundamental change, this requires huge, unfortunately, catastrophes or crises. So Europe started to become united after 2 world wars. In our part of the world, perhaps we haven't been able to advance because many of our crises have been small and in different places. But I think now things have become quite catastrophic, to the extent that I hope that out of this crisis, opportunity would appear. And I was hopeful. Yes, I am hopeful, because I think anyone working in this business, if they're not hopeful, then they are in big trouble. So, and I'll end on that.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Hesham. You've painted gloomy and daunting pictures, but you have also, painting a picture of hope. You've concluded on a note of hope, and you've linked hope to leadership. And I think we should all thank you for the leadership that you are exercising and try to see change in the way in which we conduct humanitarian action, for your resolve to see change for the sake of people in need. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.